All right, guys, so now it is time for our first set of real notes for U.S. history. So we're going to go ahead and open those right now, which are the Revolution notes, notes number 1. So this is what should be in front of you. Now, at this point in a couple of days, these will be cut out, including your notebook. So when I tell you get your notes out, notes number 1, section 2, you should just be able to flip up your notebook to the page of notes and start from there. But right now, this should be the packet in front of you. Now, Revolution notes. So obviously, we're talking about the Revolution. And if you look at section 1, this is one of the first main idea of section 1, which is leading towards war. All right, obviously telling you something that they're leading towards war. So what happened? What exactly happened that it led the colonists to organize and come together and fight against the most powerful empire in the world for their independence? So it's going to start with this first section leading towards war. But before we could get to that first section that you guys are going to T4 right now in class, I have to give you a little bit of a backstory. As I told you in the beginning of the year, history is all about stories. History is all about you knowing some information in order for when you read about something else, for it to make sense. So right now, I'm going to go over the era before the Revolution, which is loosely known as the colonial era, the era of the colonies. Right? And I'm sure you guys have heard this stuff because you should have covered it before. But in the case of the U.S. history, we're going to concentrate on England's participation in colonial history, right? So we're not going to go and talk about Christopher Columbus in 792. You know, that he represented Spain and he went all over what he called the New World. We're going to start with England, which is kind of the Pilgrims. And you guys have heard of the Pilgrims before. You know, these guys here who came on one of these ships, they're going to cross the ocean with the idea of coming here to what is the eastern part of the United States and establishing a colony for England, for people to come and live and be able to survive. Now, when they first got here, though, there was nothing here. So we're talking about the 1500s. There's nothing here. It's just forest. There is no Starbucks to go to. There's not even a port for the ship to go into. It's just basically a beach that you land on, and now you got to go survive. And in the east coast of the United States, they're going to quickly find out how dangerous it is because of diseases, because of the severe winters that they have here, how cold and people freeze to death. And they're also going to find out about Native Americans. Now, in the beginning, Native Americans were very welcoming to them. But as time went on, and essentially Native Americans felt they got abused or screwed over by these colonists coming in from Europe, some of these Native American tribes get very defensive and some of them get violent. So it's a scary thing to come to this brand new world, as they call it, the New World, and with nothing here. So eventually more and more people are going to come, and the first major settlement or the first major colony will be set up in Virginia in Jamestown. It looked like this. Now, as you could tell, it's not much of a city, but it is the first settlement. It has walls for protection, and it has multiple homes. And the idea, and see if you look at the flag, is representing the British. So the idea is that there is a place together where people live and live with each other so they could survive. Because a lot of these places, a lot of these colonies that were started up, the British would come in the spring, in February, in March, and bring food and supplies and bring these people, set them up, and then they would leave to go back to after a couple months of setting them up, they would leave and go back to England. The following spring, they would come back and everybody's dead because they starved to death or because there was a Native American attack that killed them or disease, whatever it was. So it didn't, for the first colony, wasn't something that happened easily and right off the bat. It took a while, but this is it, Jamestown. And eventually across the eastern part of what is now the United States, one colony after another will be set up in New York, in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, all the way down to Georgia. And these colonists started to, survive, not die. So at a certain point, England, though, is going to get involved more and more with fighting against France. France and England will go through a struggle about 100 years where essentially they're fighting over who's the most powerful country in the world, who has more territories, who has more money and more wealth. And they essentially do not have time to look over these new colonies. And what starts as a period called solitary neglect, which basically this period of solitary neglect is the idea that the colonists were mostly left alone. The British told them, look, we own you, you belong to us, but we're going to leave you alone. We set you up, you're not dying anymore, go and take care of yourselves, run your colony, run your trade, make money. But essentially, you still belong to us, we're just going to give you alone. And that period of solitary neglect lasted almost 100 years. So these colonists, for about 100 years, were left alone for the most part. They did what they wanted. They elected their own leaders. They passed their own laws and their own rules. They traded who they wanted, because trade was a pretty big thing already for them, and they were making money, and they were trading like this. They traded to Europe, to several countries in Europe. They even traded to Africa and to what they call the West Indies right here, where it's not Puerto Rico and Cuba and so on, but they call it the West Indies. And there was a lot of trade going on all over the place. And essentially, these colonies, like this one that was all over the East Coast, were told, hey, you're on your own. So basically, you got to struggle and you got to survive. As this period of solitary neglect, like they lasted about 100 years, went by, the colonists actually became really good. They got bigger and bigger, and they were growing in population, they were growing in wealth, they were growing in trade, and one slowly and slowly, they became profitable and are making money. And the British are basically leaving them alone until about maybe 10 years before the Revolutionary War, when the British and the French are going to fight what's called the French and Indian War. And in this French and Indian War, the British are going to win, but they are going to win and ultimately become the most powerful country in the world by beating France in that war. But they're going to be broke. They're going to be in debt. A lot of money is spent on going to war. And as I told you, for about 100 years, while they ignored the colonies during that solitary neglect time, they essentially were fighting the French back and forth, back and forth. And that's a lot of money to be spent. So they realized the British realized they have to come back to the colonies and start to charge them taxes, start to tell them what to do again, because there's a lot of money to be made in the colonies. The colonies are successful now, and they are making money. So now here comes the British back and essentially say, hey, remember us? You know how we own you? Well, now you're going to have to start paying your fair share of being in the British Empire and start paying your taxes. Well, for the colonies, their attitude is, but why? You guys left us alone. We've been doing great without you. And the British response is, yeah, because we let you be on your own. We gave you that opportunity and we're back. It's time to start paying your dues as a colony. And you got to pay your taxes. You belong to us. We gave you some freedom, but now we're saying that we're back. And this is what begins this attitude that the colonies are going to have with the British. The British come back and their attitude is, why are you guys complaining? Quit your whining. We own you. Whatever we tell you to do, you just do, and that's it. The colonies kept on pushing back and saying, it's not fair. You left us alone. We survived on our own. We prospered. We started making money on our own. So why should we just do what you said? And the response by the British is, because we own you. Shut up, pay your taxes, and do what you're told. This is what's going to lead to the constant clashing between the two sides that eventually will lead us to the revolution. Eventually to the first conflict between the two sides, eventually to them even going to war. But it starts off with that attitude. The British had this attitude of like father-son. The British think that they're the father, the colonies are like the son, and the father tells the son what to do, and the son should do it and shut the hell up. Well, the colonies didn't see it as father-son. The colonies felt like they were like the younger brother, and that England was like their older brother. And yeah, they're older and they know more, but I don't have to do everything my older brother tells me to do. This difference in perception of what the colonies in England were is what's constantly going to lead them to clash and clash and clash until eventually it leads to war. So again, the British see it as, we own you, do what you're told, shut up. The colonies' attitude is, you abandon us, so we don't have to do everything you say. We were on our own and we did fine. You don't have to come back. So this constant difference of opinion of what the reality is of who owns the colonies and how the colonies should be treated is what's ultimately going to push these two sides to get to go to war. So in section 1, leading towards war, is where you're going to begin to see when the British come back. So this right here is the period. So this section 1 and section 2 is the period right after solitary neglect's end, right after the British come back, essentially. So now I want you to go ahead and to T4 section 1 and find out what were the first things that happened that essentially pissed off the colonies enough that violence is going to erupt. But if you look at section 2, violence begins. So this is what pissed off the colonies and the British at the same time that led to the colonies fighting and eventually the war started. All right, so that was the period before the revolution. And now it's time to T4. Go ahead and T4 section 1.